On the 15th of March, 44 BC, the most powerful man in the world was ambushed in the Roman Senate.
The need to kill the tyrant is a horrifying story of hunting down a human as if they were an animal.
The killing of Julius Caesar is the most famous assassination in history.
I think the assassination is one of the greatest political dramas that ever was.
It's a story of violence, intrigue, and power. At its heart is a man who risked everything for glory.
It's the measure of how important military achievement was to Caesar that he was prepared to sacrifice so much to win it.
To his people, he was a hero. To his enemies, he was a tyrant. And to this day, his legacy continues to ignite fierce debate.
There was nothing cruel or wicked about Caesar. He might seem to us arrogant, autocratic, but that's just being a Roman.
2,000 years on, one burning question remains. How could Rome's greatest general, a man adored by his own people, end up murdered by his own friends and allies? On the 10th of January, 49 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar stood with his army on the shores of the Rubicon River. Across its waters lay Italy, Rome, and the biggest decision of his life.
The position of the river Rubicon is extremely important. It's the boundary into Italy. No general at the head of his army is meant to cross that river with his troops. And so to do so is an act of treachery against the state and a declaration, in effect, of war.
Crossing the Rubicon to this day means the fateful decision that once completed cannot be reversed.
Caesar was on his way home after 8 years fighting in the farthest reaches of Rome's empire.
This is a man who has conquered Gaul, who's been the first Roman to travel into Britain twice, pushing the boundaries of empire to the very edges of the known world.
By 49 BC, Caesar is by far the most powerful political figure in the whole of the empire, making him very famous, very rich, very powerful, and at the head of the best army in the Roman Empire at the time.
Caesar had it all. But in spite of all this, he was in danger of losing everything. When he left Rome 8 years before, he was in the middle of a bitter power struggle with members of Rome's political elite, the Senate.
Caesar had never had a happy relationship with the Senate. It had always been a force of opposition to his own ambitions.
The Senate of Rome is it's a big council which has hundreds of members, but they're all rich people. In fact, they're all rich men. And many of them are the children of other senators. They think of themselves as having a kind of hereditary right to rule.
Caesar had discovered that his enemies in the Senate were plotting to put him on trial the moment he returned to Rome.
He is in a situation where he almost has to either roll over and let the Senate win, or he has to come out fighting.
Caesar knew that if he returned to Rome without his troops, he would be ruined. But he also knew that to cross into Italy with his army would drag the nation into all-out war.
He understands that you have to take great risks if you're going to win the greatest of prizes. And it's that kind of decision that he's making at the Rubicon.
Everything that Caesar had ever done in his career pointed to the fact that he was not going to permit his enemies to drag him down, and he would rather drag Rome and the Republic down with him rather than allow that to happen.
Caesar took the greatest gamble of his life. Uttering the now infamous words, Alia jacta est, the die is cast, he ordered his men to cross the Rubicon and march on Rome.
He's a restless, unstoppable force of nature, and he's just going to go on and on and on until he's stopped.
You get the correct impression of a man who was a gambler. But he was a gambler who always made sure that the odds were in his favour. And it's that made him the extraordinary, and to his enemies, extraordinarily lethal person that he was.
Caesar was about to show his enemies just how ruthless he could be. On the 10th of January 49 BC, when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to his death. But the immediate impact of his act was to plunge Rome into a catastrophic civil war. For the next 18 months, he pursued the Senate's forces through Italy, Spain, and Greece.
Civil wars had resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of citizen soldiers. These are not professional fighters, these are ordinary citizens of Rome who are dragged into these patrician battles and suffer terrible consequences.
Both sides suffered, but in the end it was Caesar whose gamble paid off. On the 9th of August, he secured a decisive defeat over the Senate's forces and emerged from the war victorious. By taking on the Senate and winning, he had shown the world what he was capable of.
We do have a picture of Caesar, and I think it fits in a way the classic picture of a psychopath. A man who thinks the rules don't apply to him. And his willingness to bet the farm, highly intelligent, very charming, as psychopaths often are.
Caesar needed to draw on all of his charm if he wanted to reunite Rome, which stood dangerously divided. So, in the aftermath of his victory at Pharsalus, Caesar reached out to one of his former enemies, up-and-coming senator Marcus Junius Brutus.
Because of Brutus's standing in the senatorial aristocracy, he's a man that Caesar is very keen to win over.
It was incredibly important in Rome to have the right surname, or name, let's say, and Brutus was the greatest name probably you could have had in Rome.
Brutus was a prominent member of Rome's aristocratic elite, but that wasn't the only reason Caesar chose him.
Brutus is the son of the great love of Caesar's life, and there are all kinds of rumours that he was his son. I mean, probably not true, but it's undoubtedly the case that Caesar looks on Brutus with great fondness and an almost paternal sense of affection.
I think he truly loves and respects Brutus, and I suppose you could imagine that if Caesar didn't have an heir, Brutus would have been his natural successor.
Caesar forgave Brutus for fighting against him in the Civil War, and sealed the deal with a lucrative gift: the governorship of Gaul. In one deft move, Caesar had bought himself the loyalty of one of Rome's noblest figures, then sent him abroad, out of reach of those who might try to break up their friendship. It must have seemed like a political masterstroke. Caesar returned to Rome in victory, but he knew there was a huge task ahead. First, he had to win over the people of Rome, and then the ruling elite, by casting himself as the savior of the city. He entered Rome in triumph, with his face painted red like Jupiter, the king of the gods.
Caesar comes into Rome. He says, look, I've done what all Romans should do. I've defeated lots of foreign nations. Here I am. Here's all the booty. Celebrate with me.
Caesar had even more to celebrate than just his military conquests. He had also been elected dictator of Rome to steer the city through its time of crisis. This title gave Caesar sole authority over the Roman Empire, but the position was only intended to be temporary.
The title of dictator was an old one, and indeed an honourable one, and was designed for periods of emergency and was strictly limited to 6 months.
After that, dictators had to hand power back to the people. The law was designed to protect the Republic from a repeat of Rome's past, when the state was ruled by tyrannical kings.
Well, what's fundamental to the Roman understanding of how the Republic functions is that it is born out of the overthrow of a monarchy, and that therefore opposition to the idea of one man having permanent and supreme power is in the lifeblood of every Roman citizen. It's the essence of Roman citizenship.
Caesar's first target was to win over the people of Rome. So he kicked things off with 40 days of lavish festivities, all staged in his honour.
He has 4,000 captive soldiers from Gaul fight to death in the Circus Maximus, along with 200 cavalry and 20 elephants, just to spice it up a bit.
Banquets for thousands of people. Enormous gladiatorial combats, great processions through the streets.
This is stuff which is unheard of on a scale that is unprecedented.
Caesar's triumphs were like nothing Rome had ever seen.
And he provided the Roman people with the kind of entertainments that they enjoyed. He let them know that he shared their enthusiasms and their passions.
Caesar may have won over the people, but he would find it harder to gain the trust of Rome's political elite, whom he had beaten in battle and who now anxiously watched his every move.
It's difficult to know what people thought was going to happen when Caesar came home. One option would be Caesar could stand down. He could resign his dictatorship and simply be honoured. But maybe people did think Caesar's won his civil war, he's rich, maybe he'll retire.
If they believed that, they were in for a shock. 6 months passed, and more, and still Caesar did not step down. But neither did he seek vengeance over his former enemies. Instead, in a radical and unexpected move, he forgave them.
So when Caesar makes it clear that he is going to be merciful, that's a really important message. And it makes it easier for men not to oppose him.
There've been enough killings already. If you want to reconcile, if you want to master legitimacy, better to forgive.
But there was a darker side to his clemency.
We tend to have a Christian perspective on the idea of forgiveness. We see it as a virtue, pure and simple. But in Roman terms, it's a far more aggressive act. To show someone mercy is to put them in your debt. And while certainly, they may be grateful that they haven't had their heads chopped off, that doesn't stop their sense of resentment from festering.
Caesar had neutralized his former enemies in the Senate. Now he set about using his great wealth to consolidate his popularity with the people of Rome.
Remember, Rome at this stage is a huge city. It's become 1 million strong, which is colossal by pre-industrial standards. So vast numbers of these people are effectively disenfranchised. They have nothing to do with the high politics of the Senate.
Caesar spent vast sums of money constructing new buildings and temples all over the city. He generated much-needed work for Rome's unemployed. And his generosity did not end there.
They get food in the free grain dole, they get land from him, they get debt relief, all of which is popular and does bring real benefits to people.
The people began to think of Caesar as a god, but not surprisingly, many of the aristocrats were much harder to win over.
The Roman elite are extremely willing to characterise any method to alleviate poverty among the Roman people as a gesture towards tyranny.
Very many of the classic tyrants had set themselves up as champions of the people. These were sort of renegade aristocrats who'd broken with their own class, and Julius Caesar absolutely fits that archetype.
Rome's elite were appalled. It seemed to them he was trying to buy power through the people. But what really lay behind Caesar's populist reforms is still hotly debated.
I think he is a man who believes at heart that the Roman people are sovereign, that they deserve a share of the benefits of empire, that you cannot simply acquire an empire and carve it up between the gentleman's club that the Senate is.
I think this notion that he was somehow a great sort of champion of the people, he was a sort of Tony Benn in a toga, is ludicrous. He knew how to manipulate the masses, and he knew it was important to have them on his side. But I don't think there was anyone grander than Caesar. And to see him in some way as a sort of tribune of the people is crazy, in my view.
Caesar had sealed his popularity with the people through games, food, and jobs. Now he could set about his plans to transform the Senate. In a dramatic shake-up, Caesar flooded it with new members, expanding the ancient institution from 600 to 900 senators.
He thought that the gene pool from which it was drawn was too shallow. He wouldn't have used those phrases, obviously, but he brought in foreigners, which is considered outrageous. He brought in all sorts of non-aristocratic figures.
Caesar argued that Rome's old senatorial system of government was no longer fit for purpose.
What Caesar recognises is that if the Roman Empire is going to succeed, the kind of government that had succeeded for a small city-state was completely inappropriate.
I think he had a sense that unless there was major reform inside the Roman political system, the empire was going to be destabilised.
But Rome's existing elite deeply resented the arrival of these foreign interlopers.
And there are these jokes about Gauls coming to the Senate House in tartan trousers. I mean, of course, it never happened, but we know those kind of jokes from our society. And so what this tells you is about embattled privilege.
Old money, if you like, inherited wealth, if you like, feels threatened. And they are pushed into a very reactionary, anti-reform kind of politics.
Caesar was revamping the Roman state, but he also had ulterior motives for expanding the Senate.
The more straightforward way to look at his new senators is to say this is a way of rewarding your followers. You bring in new people and you know they'll be loyal to you because they owe their position entirely to you rather than to any process of election.
Caesar was playing a skillful political game, winning popularity with the people and packing the Senate with men loyal to him. Now, only one thing could undermine his achievement.
I think that in my lifetime, we have had two long-serving, really first-rate prime ministers who both went slightly dotty in office, Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. And if that can happen to you as being British Prime Minister with that amount of power, Imagine if you're Caesar, if you're the most powerful man, the most famous man in the world. Of course, who is not, in that circumstance, going to part company with reality?
By 44 BC, Caesar's dictatorship had been extended long beyond the immediate crisis. It was now in its 4th year, with no sign that Caesar would stand down. The elite were getting nervous, and Caesar was beginning to show signs that power was going to his head.
Caesar has his own chair in which he sits that separates him from everybody else, that clearly indicates that he's not just one among other politicians, but he somehow has special status. He gets the entitlement to wear in public events the kind of clothing that is associated with generals when they triumph and with the old kings of Rome. These are all slaps in the face constantly to his fellow Romans.
Caesar's behavior was disturbingly similar to Rome's tyrant kings of old. His enemies and even some of his allies were becoming anxious, so they turned to the gods for guidance.
Prophecy is a very deep-rooted part of Roman religion, and the Romans believed profoundly that it was possible to divine the future.
Senators, slaves, even Caesar himself consulted mystics. And around that time, they had many ominous events to interpret.
Portents, tremendous unnatural events that indicate that something catastrophic, cosmic, is going to happen.
The portents spelt danger for Rome, and Caesar himself was singled out for special attention. A soothsayer is said to have warned him to beware one particular day, the Ides of March.
He doesn't strike me as someone who worried too much about whether he was offending the gods. He thought he was a god.
Common humanity might believe in what the soothsayers are saying, but they don't apply to Caesar. He's too close to the gods, I think, to be affected by these things.
But Caesar, now feeling invincible, ignored the threats. Meanwhile, Rome's senators were divided on how to deal with their dictator. While some harbored growing resentment, others continued to shower Caesar with honors.
I think the Senate heaps honor after honor on Caesar because they've got into the habit of being toadies, and this is what the ruler expects.
But if the Senate believed that bestowing honors on Caesar would win his respect, one decisive event showed how deeply wrong they were. In early 44 BC, a group of senators went to see Caesar to announce a whole raft of new titles in thanks for his deeds.
Caesar, with all the wealth that he's plundered from Gaul and his other conquests, has lavished on building this fabulous streamlined square fashioned out of marble. And when they come to visit him there, rather than stand, as a senator should when greeting his other senators, he remains sitting.
Protocol is really important in any traditional society, and Rome's a traditional society. You stand for your superiors.
The senators were incensed by Caesar's show of blatant disrespect.
Caesar made a very serious political error when he failed to stand up, and I think he realized pretty soon afterwards as well, because his supporters put out this ludicrous story that he was suffering from diarrhea and therefore couldn't stand up without embarrassment. It was a signal of contempt.
I think he just didn't care. He had a kind of pathologist's gaze. He could see that this form of government was dead. he was in a hurry to establish something new, and he felt that the sort of hidebound conservatism of senators and the prickliness of their dignity was something with which he was increasingly impatient and unwilling to pander to.
That is the problem for Caesar, the problem for any dictator. They don't know when to stop. There is no one who can actually tell them that they are behaving in a way that is self-destructive. No one dares go near them. And if they did, they probably wouldn't be listened to. And I think that was a significant moment in solidifying support against Caesar.
Some senators had begun to talk for the first time about how to get rid of Caesar. But the plotters needed a leader, and all eyes were on Marcus Brutus, Caesar's ally, who had returned to Rome from Gaul.
I think the way the Senate works is that some people have a higher sort of standing than others, and their approval matters. And so having people like Brutus on your side in any period makes your cause seem more noble.
Brutus had the ideal credentials to lead a plot against a tyrant.
The salient thing about Brutus is that he is descended from an earlier Brutus, the man who, according to Roman tradition, had been responsible for getting rid of the king, driving the monarchy out. And Brutus himself, of course, was very aware of that tradition.
And I think he holds that quite firmly in his heart, that that's who we are. We are the people who seek and find and get freedom and keep it.
Tyrannicide was in Brutus's blood. But when he returned from Gaul, he still saw the alliance with Caesar as his best option. The conspirators had to sever his ties to the dictator, so they came up with a plan. Around this time, graffiti began to appear in the city, with messages like "Brutus sleeps" and "Thou art not really Brutus." The plotters were playing on Brutus's greatest vulnerability, his fierce family pride. The plan worked, as Brutus began to waver.
We see Brutus as torn between his loyalty to Caesar, and in the Roman world, friendship is absolutely fundamental value. You must not betray your friends. And he is torn between duty to the state and duty to his friends.
Brutus has an extremely difficult decision to make. In his own way, possibly, a decision as difficult as the decision which Caesar had taken at the Rubicon.
Brutus, Caesar's great ally, was teetering on the brink of rebellion. But Caesar appeared totally oblivious to the plots and conspiracies. And instead of clamping down, he did something extraordinary. He got rid of his bodyguard.
Caesar's decision to dispense with his bodyguard is one of the craziest acts that one can imagine any ruler contemplating.
Caesar was a risk taker throughout his life, even in the battlefield. He was brave. So maybe this is an act of bravery not to surround yourself by bodyguards.
And I think that it was part of Caesar's delusional state that no one would dare touch him.
I think also he is buoyed by his sense that there is no alternative. If he gets killed, then all it means is that civil war will flare up once again. And even his enemies understand that.
Caesar had upturned Rome's Senate, mortally offended its leading men, and dismissed all threats against him. He was playing a highly dangerous game. And what he did next would rock the foundations of the Republic to its core. Up to this point, Caesar had been extending a dictatorship that was supposed to be temporary. But in early February 44 BC, Caesar did something that flew in the face of 400 years of Republican tradition. He became dictator for life. No other Roman had ever dared take this title.
What in effect he is saying is, the position that I hold is permanent. I can't be got rid of because the stability of the state has come to depend upon me.
Saying I'm going to be dictator forever, more or less says I will be dictator till I die. And if you want that to be a shorter period rather than a longer one, I'm going to have to die sooner, aren't I? It was almost an invitation to assassination.
Caesar, in his quest for total power, was now gambling with his life.
And he falls in that sense into the classic pattern of charismatic leaders like Napoleon, like Hitler, who are immensely successful, but must ultimately fail, because sooner or later you will roll the dice one time too many.
And Caesar had not finished rolling the dice. Not content with life dictatorship, the very next day Caesar set out to test the limits of his power at one of Rome's biggest annual festivals, the Lupercalia.
The festival of the Lupercalia takes you right back to the origins of Rome. It's a day on which the ghosts of the dead are supposed to walk the streets of the city.
And it seems to involve aristocratic men running through the streets of Rome. People who are normally very dignified are allowed to behave in strange and bizarre ways. It's time out. It's carnival.
Caesar himself on that day his dress is that of a patrician, harking back again to the sort of the beginnings of the Roman state.
As the festivities continued, a mysterious episode unfolded. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest allies, approached Caesar and offered him a crown. Caesar made a great show of refusing, and the crowd cheered its support.
It's clearly stage managed. Caesar and Antony are thick as thieves. What's the game? Is the game to see whether everybody shouts, "Put the crown on, Caesar, we want you to be king"? Or is it to see what happens if Caesar says, "No, I don't need a crown, I'm an honest, humble Roman like anybody else"?
It is a mysterious episode, but I think psychologically and politically it fits with the idea that Caesar was quite interested in becoming king and was interested in seeing what people would make of it.
And because it's wrapped up inside the Lupercalia, they could always say, well, crazy things happen at Carnival.
One man in particular was deeply unsettled by these events. Marcus Junius Brutus.
And what he sees with Caesar is a man who's changed from being an heroic figure, who's linked the country together, to being a man who is set to be king, and that's intolerable to him.
And I think at that point, it was clear to anybody that you had a choice. You either this is a total one-man show, or you had to remove this man.
Brutus's ancestors had driven out Rome's tyrannical kings. Now he was faced with a man who appeared to want to take the crown. The time for reflection was over. Brutus joined the conspirators.
As a man who claimed to belong to a family which had got rid of the kings, how could Brutus not act?
And I suspect that the feelings of personal regret that he felt at having to kill Caesar, who had always shown him such favour and whom he clearly liked, in a sense only made him feel more of a hero.
With Brutus on side, the conspiracy became very real. But there wasn't long to act. After years in Rome dealing with the city's day-to-day running, Caesar, the great general, was becoming impatient.
Glory comes from arms. Glory doesn't come from making sure the sewage system works in Rome and draining the marshes or whatever.
There is a sense, I think, in which ultimately he decides it's all a bit boring and it's all a bit beneath him. And so that's why he hasn't been back in Rome very long before he's deciding that really what he wants to do is to go east and sort out the Parthians.
Then he's constantly thinking about the next war. You know, he's restless. It's like the classic definition of a shark. It can't stop moving forwards.
Caesar announced that he would leave Rome and embark on a new military expedition to the east. He gave a date for his departure, March the 18th. The conspirators now had less than a fortnight in which to act.
And they realised that now there is a ticking clock, that on the 18th of March, this man is leaving Rome and he will be surrounded by thousands of armed men. Therefore, if we are going to do something about it, we have to do it before the 18th of March.
As preparations for his departure began in earnest, so too did the plot against his life. Caesar had set a deadline for his own assassination. On the morning of the Ides of March, Caesar was preparing to meet with the Senate. This would be his last Senate appearance before departing for Parthia in 3 days' time. Soon he would be away from Rome and out of the reach of his enemies.
He's been dealing with this hothouse of Roman politics now since the end of the Civil War. He's been the target of abuse, of attacks, of criticism. I think probably he rather relished the idea that very soon he'd be back with his soldiers, back on campaign, back with the band of brothers with whom he had won the Gallic War.
That same morning, Rome was preparing itself for a day of public games. Across town, animals were readied for sacrifice in honor of the gods. But for Caesar, the day began with ominous signs that the gods were not on his side.
On the morning of the 15th of March, Julius Caesar's wife Calpurnia tells him that she has had terrifying dreams, portents that suggest that this is an evil day for him, that he must not go to the Senate.
I think he probably would have listened to her at any other time, but there's such a determination in him not to be cowed, even by the gods and even by these portents, that he pushes on through.
Caesar had made up his mind. He left for the Senate. On his way there, Caesar encountered the same soothsayer who had warned him to be wary of this day. Caesar taunted the soothsayer, saying, "The Ides of March are come." The soothsayer responded, "The Ides have come, but not yet gone."
The day that Caesar goes there is a day of festivity, and in the theatre itself there are blood sports going on, and so as Caesar walks into the meeting with the Senate, he would have heard the cheers and roar of the people watching spectacles of blood.
Caesar arrived to the meeting late. When he got there, the conspirators were ready and waiting. The assassins began to close in on their target.
Each one's got a dagger, they've concealed it, they've brought the daggers into the Senate house.
And then the first blow, of course, is struck by Casca.
Then he turns around and then a slash, and then suddenly there's a whole rain of daggers.
They drove their blades home with blow after blow.
The assassination of Caesar is extraordinarily brutal, as if it were the hunt of a wild animal, as if Julius Caesar has been reduced to a beast who has to be trapped and killed. And in the course of being stabbed, he catches sight of Brutus.
What really stops him struggling, what makes him accept his fate, is seeing Brutus. And he doesn't say et tu, Brute, he says kai su teknon, and you, my child, my boy.
Plutarch says Brutus struck Caesar in his private parts. It's a horrific image, killing him in that particular way. It's very, very powerful and almost sort of brutally domestic.
So he is now utterly betrayed, and that must have been something of which Brutus would be aware, that this is what it would feel like to look that person in the eye, that person who has protected you and supported you all your life, and then to stab them.
He slumps to the ground, and his last act is to cover his head with his toga, because even in death it is unthinkable that Caesar display weakness.
Brutus and the assassins took to the streets to announce the death of the dictator.
This isn't an act of somebody who is ambivalent about what they've done. They want to make it public. They want to be sure that everybody knows that they've done this and that they're proud of doing it and that they've done it for you. They've done it for Rome.
But if they hoped to be hailed as saviors of the Republic, they were in for a shock. Their rallying cry of liberty was met with horror by many Romans who were appalled by Caesar's assassination.
It starts to dawn on Brutus in particular that although he has rescued the Republic from tyranny, maybe the Republic is not there any longer to be rescued.
The great error of the conspirators was to believe that by cutting off the head of the snake, as it were, you'd killed the monster. In fact, you merely made the monster much more dangerous.
By killing Caesar, the conspirators had acted to save the Republic, but what they had actually achieved was its destruction. In the 400 years that followed, a whole line of emperors took sole power of the Roman Empire, and they all took the name Caesar.
It's gone down in history not as a noble act, but as a great betrayal. And I'm afraid that the conspirators bear a lot of the responsibility for that because of their own incompetence.
Let's be clear, the Ides of March achieved nothing at all. It didn't derail the movement towards monarchy. It didn't take away somebody who was a cruel tyrant and put in place a better monarch. There was nothing cruel or wicked about Caesar. He might seem to us arrogant, autocratic, but that's just being a Roman.
Over on our brand new channel Spike next, the action hero season continues with Wesley Snipes as a special agent caught up in a conspiracy that leads all the way to the White House. In Art of War 2, The Betrayal. Next here on Channel 5, Alex Polizzi heads to Gloucester in The New Hotel Inspector.